Great. Good afternoon, and thank you for your patience. As you know, today is the International Day of Education, and that's why we're delighted to welcome here Charles North, the Acting Chief Executive Officer of the Global Partnership for Education. He will address you on the impact of the pandemic on education. I also want to flag that today there is a message from the Secretary General on this day, who notes that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused chaos in education worldwide, and school closures continue to disrupt the lives of millions of students. The Secretary General says in his message that he will be convening a summit on transforming education later this year, saying that the summit will be the first time that world leaders, young people, and all education stakeholders come together to consider fundamental questions. And also want to flag that our colleagues at Education Cannot Wait, the Global Fund for Education Emergencies, are marking the day with an announcement of $228 million in new funding from Germany. This brings the trust fund to up to $1.1 billion. On that somewhat positive note, welcome, Charles, and you have the floor, and then we'll take some questions.
Great, thank you. Microphone's on?
It's on, yep.
Okay, super. Thank you. Good to see you all, and thank you for having me. As you mentioned, this is the International Day for Education. It's therefore very appropriate that with the pandemic soon to be entering its third year, that we take this moment to recognize the tremendous courage of all the children around the world who continue to strive to get their education. Now, we also should recognize and applaud those who are supporting those children in getting their education. Of course, their parents, their teachers, administrators, all who are working tirelessly to keep schools open, to switch to, adapt to remote learning, and to restart classes after many months of closure. But we cannot escape the fact that the pandemic is leaving millions of poor and marginalized children even farther behind. On this International Day of Education, the global community must do more before the COVID pandemic makes permanent the inexcusable gap between how much rich and poor children learn. Even before COVID turned the world upside down, we faced an entrenched and protracted education crisis. Nearly 250 million children were out of school, largely because their families were unable to afford to send them to school. Their schools were too far away, or the schools were just inadequate for their needs, especially for those children with disabilities. And even among children who were in school, too many were not learning. In the lowest income countries, 8 out of 10 children left primary school without even the most basic reading skills. COVID-19 has imposed new and daunting barriers for children being in school and learning. During 2020 alone, more than 1.6 billion children around the world were shut out of school. In many countries, the shift to remote learning has brought on additional challenges. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where over 80% of households lack household internet access, and nearly 90% do not have a home computer. In fact, the school closures from the pandemic may have a permanent impact on those vulnerable children. An estimated 24 million children may never see the inside of a classroom again. As many as 13 million girls could be forced into early marriage, their educations cut short as families struggle to bear the economic costs of the pandemic. In addition to early marriage, countless children are being pressed into work or recruited as fighters, while others are trapped in abusive or violent households without hope of relief. We must prevent these grim outcomes, as it is far harder to reverse them once they've begun. To do that, education actors should use this moment to redouble all efforts to transform education systems so that even the most isolated or excluded children in our societies can learn.
Let me just make this better.
Okay, very good. But instead, education budgets are shrinking, putting at risk hard-won gains, especially girls' enrollment. 2/3 of low and middle-income countries reduced their education budgets since the beginning of the crisis. To give partner countries alternatives to slashing their education spending, early in the pandemic, GPE quickly provided $500 million in financing to 66 countries. In Rwanda, for example, the funds are being used for distance learning programs over radio, and television. In Sudan, the funds are being used to develop safety and health messages to protect adolescent girls from sexual abuse, violence, and teen pregnancy. To support lower-income countries through this crisis while transforming their education systems to make them fit for the 21st century, GPE held a global education summit last July, where public and private donors pledged $4 billion to GPE's fund. We expect to raise another $1 billion by 2025 to get 175 million children in school and learning. A fully funded GPE would help durably transform education and increase by 30% the amount that low-income countries can spend on crucial education reforms that go beyond simply meeting ongoing costs. Country governments must also do their part. Domestic financing for education is the largest and most durable source of funding. GPE advocates that governments allocate 20% of their budgets for education. But beyond the volume of resources, GPE also advocates for and supports governments to improve the efficiency of education spending to ensure that funds are distributed equitably to reach the most marginalized children. Making this commitment is essential for girls and boys to realize their potential and to drive the economy's economic growth. For example, 12 years of schooling for every girl would boost economies through an additional $30 trillion in lifetime earnings. Tomorrow, our board chair, His Excellency Dr. Jakaya Kikwete, the former president of Tanzania, will meet with the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on education and the challenges facing millions of children around the world. We want to thank and commend the Secretary General for the announcement of a summit on transforming education, which will provide an important opportunity to address the systemic constraints that prevent children from getting an education, including the lack of investment. We should commit ourselves to making every day an International Day of Education, a time to grasp the threat to our future and shift our attention and resources towards transforming education systems so every child, especially the most vulnerable, can get a quality education. Thank you.
Charles, thank you very much. First question to Edie Leder, Associated Press.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. A couple of follow-up questions. First, what's the status of what you're trying to do, particularly in conflict areas for children? We know that in many of them, kids just run around and really don't have a chance for a real education. And secondly, in terms of underfunding, can you tell us who are the largest funders of your efforts? Are they governments? Are they foundations? Are they individuals? And who are you targeting? Thank you.
Sure. So as you've noted, the crises, conflict, and other fragility challenges are keeping so many children out of school and undermining their educations. So GPE has a particular protocol for working in such situations so that we often can work outside of with the governments, but also directly with development partners to provide support so those education systems don't collapse. And it's critical to keep those children in school, and particularly girls we need attention to girls because they are usually the first ones to be excluded. So we are working in such places as Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, We're providing support in those places, and it's very difficult places to work, but it is vitally important that we do continue that work so those education systems don't collapse. Now, in Afghanistan, obviously, we're facing a particular situation, political change there, that we are very concerned about girls' education. It is essential that girls be given the opportunity for an education 12 years and beyond, so they realize their own potential, but also so they can meet the needs of a future of Afghanistan. Pardon my voice. So we are working there with our development partners who are on the ground to understand what is the best role that GPE can play and how our resources might be used, how they might be affected as we move forward. We do note that the government has identified, as said, that girls will be able to go back to school in March. We want to ensure that that actually happens, that it doesn't mean just primary school, but it means all levels of education. So we look to the government in Afghanistan to commit to ensuring that all children are able to school, but particularly girls. And as we work with all our partners, we will be looking at ways to ensure that the education system does not collapse for lack of funding. In terms of who our largest supporters are, we work primarily with donor governments, the primary sources of our funding. The largest ones, I don't know exactly the ranking, but the European Union, the UK, and the United States are among the top ones. So we also have begun receiving funds directly into our GPE fund from the Lego Foundation. They've given us, I believe it's about $100 million this year. But we're also working with private sector and other development finance institutions to use innovative finance, to leverage other funds that we can use to support the transformation of education.
Thank you. I think we have a question online. Nabil from Al Arabi. Nabil?
Nabil? Yes, thank you, Stefan. So, thank you, Stefan. Mr. Roth, I would like to ask you about the impact of like some internal political crisis in some of the countries in the Middle East. I can talk about Lebanon or Sudan. Can you maybe tell us in numbers or details, if available, about the impact of the internal political crises in these countries on education, and if you have a message to the governments of these countries, I would like also to hear it from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So again, you've noted the areas of conflict and crisis and the potential for impact on the education of children. So I'm not going to take position on a particular crisis as such, but other than to say that everybody involved needs to be conscious of the critical importance of getting children back into school and learning. Now, in the case of you mentioned Lebanon. Lebanon is not a country that we're engaged in, but in the case of Sudan, you have a country that has the largest number of children who are out of school in the entire Middle East and North Africa region. So their education systems there are very much struggling from lack of qualified teachers, lack of materials, poor infrastructure. So now what GPE did in that case is we've worked with the government, across the government, but also with a consultative with all the partners working in Sudan to identify the critical issues that need to be addressed and come up with an overall plan to support the government in finding a way and leading the way on addressing their education needs. Now, GPE then provided funding for 22 million textbooks for the education system, and that we trained 66,000 teachers in the use of those textbooks. The impact of that work In the schools where GPE was supporting this effort, we saw a 30% increase in the reading fluency of the children there. So we can see the impact, but we need to sustain that. We can't have the political disruption undermine what is critical for keeping children in school and learning.
Thank you. Maggie Bashir, Voice of America.
I thank you, Mr. North, for the briefing. I just wanted to know, are you concerned that these will be basically lost years for these kids who are have their educations disrupted by the pandemic? Are these is this loss of learning sort of permanent for them? And also, do you have a date yet for the Education Summit? Thank you.
So on the Education Summit, let me just start there. My understanding is we're looking at September of this year. So, but beyond that, it's up to the Secretary General's office to identify the specific dates. So we're all watching that, and we're working closely with his office to support any way we can. In terms of the impact of COVID, I mean, if you think about it, teachers are always concerned at the end of a school vacation how much children have lost during that vacation. And we're usually talking about a few months. Children have been out of school for a year or more. It's huge. They've lost an entire year. It's not just the 1 year that they were out, but they've likely lost a lot of the learning that they had from before. We're also very concerned, as I noted, the number of children who may never go back to school. We have seen from the Ebola crisis in Liberia that this is a true impact, particularly on girls, that when the schools reopen, that the girls are not there. We've also seen this in Kenya just now. As schools reopened, there were twice as many boys in school as there were girls. So we have to look at what is that impact on those children. Can there be, we work hard at remedial action to ensure those children can regain the learning that was lost, and ensure that children who dropped out or not come back are somehow able to return to school. Now, many of our programs, particularly in our COVID response, are targeting girls in reaching out to them to ensure that they are being protected, as I gave the example from Sudan, but also that they are encouraged to come back to school. We are also working with a group of private corporations, tapping into their expertise in marketing to reach out to societies to educate people on the importance of girls' education and the importance of getting those children back into school. So am I worried about the lost years? Absolutely. I fear that the lost time we've had over the last 2 years could set back those children for their lifetime. Because if they progress, if they then graduate without having completed all that training, they will be set back in their ability to move on, whether to further education or into the workplace.
Thank you. Any other questions? Great. Charles, thank you very much. Thank you to your team, and thank you for all the work that you do. And we hope to see you back soon.
Great. Thank you.